good to be with you here today and to share with you an area that is on our heart, the deaf ministry. And like Brother Joseph said, you may think, well, why do I need this? Well, somewhere in your college career you need to be exposed to deaf ministry because deaf people are out there. How many deaf people are in the world? There's no number. Nobody takes a census of this. In the United States, how many deaf people are there? Nobody takes a census of things like that. That's not one of the questions they asked recently when they did the census. But the best estimates we do find in practical numbers are about one deaf person per 1,000 hearing people. So let's figure that out. In Long Beach, how many people live here? 500,000. Okay, there are going to be 500 deaf people in this area. I mean, in the immediate Long Beach area. Y'all reach out probably beyond that with your buses and things, don't you? Okay, so there are a huge number of deaf people, and I guarantee you're not going to find those deaf people in church. Now, you say, well, 500, that's not very many. Yeah, but each one of those is a soul, and each one of those is going to spend eternity somewhere. And so maybe you're studying to be a pastor, and you say, well, I'm not going to ever learn sign language and be involved in deaf ministry. Yeah, but somebody in your church may get a burden to reach deaf people, and it may come from you. And so consider this as looking at this group of people in a way that you've never seen them before. They are a culture group of people. They do have language. They have culture. We're going to emphasize that over and over again. And so you'll find that it's a different way of thinking. Today we're going to have to talk about the culture. We're going to have to talk about a little bit of their sign language and how they use it. We're not going to learn sign language. We're going to talk a little bit about the misconceptions of deaf people, and we're going to talk about how to minister to deaf people. So all of this, I hope, is going to be very practical for you. And if I can't see that clock back there very well, so if I go too far, too long, and y'all need a break, just wave at me. I do get excited about this topic. This is what we have given our lives to. I do want to introduce my wife, Diane, if she's in the back here. We're dressed alike in case you don't know who we are. We're both in black and white today. So, and by the way, I love being an interpreter because I get to dress in black all the time. That's kind of a joke among interpreters. Our basic objectives of this class are as listed here on the board. Familiarity with deafness in general, so you can have an idea of what a deaf person is, who a deaf person is, how can you recognize deafness, and what's the difference between deafness and being hearing and hard of hearing and all of those things. A general understanding of how to minister to deaf people. How do you, in your church setting, get the gospel to them? How do you help them to grow? How do you get them where they can share the gospel? How do you minister to deaf people? And then a familiarity of deaf people and their value of their culture and language. This is not in any given order. We're going to do this in a little different order. But how they value things. And then I'm going to give you a challenge on reaching deaf people. My goal behind being here is to get you involved in deaf ministry. I'll just tell you that, okay? Now, I'm not going to do all persuasive stuff today. It's not going to be a sermon. But I've been asking people to pray that the Lord would call somebody into deaf ministry because there's a tremendous need. You say, well, for 500 people, why would you give your life to something like that? But if God touches your heart for those people, you can't do anything else. And God may touch your heart and probably has for some other group of people. Let's first ask some questions. What do you know about deaf people? Tell me some things you know about deaf people. This is a class as well as, it's not a sermon, it's a class, okay? So what do you know about deaf people? Talk to me. Well, that's not much, okay? All right, you do know something about them. What do you know? What do you think you know about deaf people? Yes, sir. They can't hear. Okay, most of them can't hear. Actually, some of them can. That's a weird thought. We'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, what else? Yes, sir. They are. They're a very tight-knit group of people. Okay, probably because of the language and culture. Okay, good. What else do you know, or think you know, or think somebody else knows that you're not willing to admit to? Anything at all? Yes, sir. Okay, the actual American Sign Language is American in its nature, and it's not actually universal, and that what he mentioned there is a very common misconception. I'm not saying it's misconception that's bad. I'm saying everybody thinks the same way that what you just said. That's true. That's what people think they know about sign language. That's what we're looking for. What else do you know about deaf people or their language or their culture or anything else that you can see? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah, you actually cannot take those words and put them into sign language. So they don't have the same things. They don't have like a or an or the. They don't have things like that. They don't have ing. Now, there are several signing systems, and one of the signing systems does, but they don't modify their words the way we do. So she's saying it's a different language, and it is. Okay. What else? Anything else you know? That is true. When you get outside, the number that I mentioned in church last night, 80% of deaf people worldwide do not have access to education. That's a terribly sad number. But can you imagine growing up and not learning how to speak to your parents? Not understanding the seasons. Not having education. I talked to a deaf lady in Belize, Central America. She was, I think, 35 years old. Nobody had ever taught her that one day is different than another. And so I went through and I was talking about Jesus rising from the dead. I was talking about it being Sunday. I was trying to explain to her, what resurrections and why we went to church on Sunday and all that. And she didn't know the difference in any day of the week. When I finally explained it to her, she's in the class of ladies. When I finally got that idea across to her, she about fell out of her seat. She literally was rocked. She was 35 years old and did not know a week existed. It was amazing. And she's educable. She could learn, but nobody's taken the time to tell her. So these are some interesting things, and we're going to talk about these and more. First of all, let me tell you my story of how I got involved in the deaf ministry. Some people think it's kind of odd that a man's involved in the deaf ministry. Not at all. There are deaf men that need men to teach them. There are things that you as a man can teach that women cannot teach a deaf man. They cannot teach a deaf leader. And in fact, even in our churches, we will say that women should not be teaching a class of men. Is that correct? Okay. Well, now who's going to teach a class of men? If we're going to reach a generation of deaf people with the gospel, we have to reach the men. So who's going to reach the men? The ladies, of course. No. So I think it's interesting. In our ministry, God called the men and their wives followed. And all of the missionaries that we have 14 missionary families. One of those is a single lady missionary, so God didn't call her husband first because she doesn't have a husband yet. Maybe he did, and we just don't know who that husband is yet eventually, but she'll find him later. But God called the man in the ministry, and the wife followed. Okay, so here's my story. When I was in elementary school, we lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, and my parents took us 3 kids to the YMCA to learn how to swim. So we were learning to swim, and my mom and the mom of another boy, a deaf boy, got to be friends. Well, we ended up getting to be friends. And then we ended up going over to each other's houses and all that. Well, I didn't know sign language. His brother interpreted for us. But if you're playing guns in the woods, hide and seek, you don't need much of an interpreter. Well, our family finally moved to Florida. And when we got to Florida, I was away from deaf people entirely. That was in 6th grade. Then in 12th grade, as a senior, a man from the Bill Rice Ranch came and taught sign language at our church. And I said, I've always wanted to know that stuff. Let's try it. And so just out of a whim, just because I thought it was interesting, I took a sign language class. We learned 600 signs in 1 week. You say, that's really awesome. What's really weird is at the end of that week, we were interpreters. That man left. And he said, you're an interpreter. Can you imagine trying to interpret any language with just 600 words? And so that's what we did. And the deaf people began to come. And I went away to college. I came back, and we had a church for the deaf within our hearing church. Well, to back up just a moment, I learned sign language. I became an interpreter, began driving we had a station wagon route, not a bus route. We drive a station wagon around town. As a senior in high school, I was in charge of this, and we'd drive around and pick up these deaf people and bring them to church. And then I went off to college, and I wanted to study music. Music was my field. I had done different things in high school and gotten awards and different things, and I was planning to go into the music ministry. I wanted to serve the Lord, and that was my chosen field. That was where I felt like that I should go. And while a freshman at college, God touched my heart about deaf people. And I remember the moment when I was walking home from dinner. I'm sorry, this is always tender. I was walking home from dinner. I got on this little bridge, and I was praying and talking to the Lord. If you're talking to the Lord about His will, be careful. He'll reveal it to you. And I'm so glad He did. So I said, Lord, who's going to reach the deaf? And He said, well, you are. I'm studying music. Okay, I'll do that. And immediately I responded. I didn't walk 2 steps before I responded when the Lord told me to work with the deaf. I didn't know what that meant, but I said yes. Well, I went to this. I was in a university, and so I went to the university. I said, we don't have a sign language class here. Can I teach a sign language class? Now, keep in mind, I'm a freshman. But God had put this on my heart. I had to start teaching people. I had to start doing something about this. There were no deaf people there. We were not reaching deaf people. We were not doing anything, as far as I knew, out to help deaf people be saved. I said, I've got to teach this. Can I do this? And they said, let's think about that. And they went back and had their discussions and checked my background out and all that stuff, I'm sure. And then they came back and said, yes, we'll let you teach. We'll give you an extracurricular class. We won't pay you. Students won't pay for the class. We'll order whatever book you say, and you can teach. I thought, wow, great. I still didn't know what that meant. So they announced it in chapel, rather large place, and so the Friday afternoon class at 5 o'clock, right before supper, they gave me 45 minutes, and I stood at the door and I watched as over 100 students came into that class. I'm a freshman. I've only known sign language for 1 year, and all I had exposure to was 600 signs to begin with, and whatever else I could learn in that 1 year. But I knew God wanted me to do something. I began teaching that class. And by the way, today we have numbers of those people out in ministry. I heard of a guy in Indonesia. We connected on Facebook a few years ago, and I said, well, hey, what are you doing? And he said, I have a deaf ministry. And I said, well, but is that what you do? And he said, well, I work at the school. I teach in a Christian school, but I'm here because of deaf ministry. And I went, well, he's from that area. But he said, this is what I do. I'm in deaf ministry. Wow, I had no idea. I hadn't talked to him in years. From that beginning sign language class. Amazing. And so that's my story. And then my senior year, the Lord called me to work with missions. Diane and I eventually got married. And so in 1981, she learned sign language, and we began together ministering to deaf people. That's how I got involved. I didn't plan on doing deaf ministry, but the Lord laid it up on my heart. Let me just pause and say this. Whenever God touches your heart to do something, say yes. I look back right now. Okay, I'm 57 years old. Is that right? 57? 57. I have to keep asking, I never keep track. You don't keep track of your own birthday, so I don't. I never have. And so I always have to figure out how old I am. And so I'm 57 years old, and I look back on the years that we've done all this crazy stuff. We lived 20 years in RVs, traveling from church to church, starting deaf ministries. We've done all this, travel internationally, done all these crazy things, and taken our kids crazy places, and gotten sick in other countries and stuff. And look back on that, and you know what? I would not change it. I wouldn't. And I hope that when you get to be my age, you can look back on your ministry and say the exact same thing. And you can if you say yes, 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 yes to the Lord. Okay? Finish for that advertisement. Okay. Let me give you a theory, and we'll get started with everything. You have several pieces of literature in front of you, but first let me give you my theory. A deaf person, defined by deaf people, well, actually defined by me as I think about deaf people. A deaf person, the way we're going to talk about them today, is a person who knows American Sign Language and values deaf culture. That's a deaf person. Notice what is missing from that definition. What's that? Well, okay, gospel, okay, but I mean physically, what's missing from that definition? What's that? Lack of hearing. It has nothing to do with their lack of hearing. Many deaf people can hear. That's weird. They can hear. Some of them can hear you talk. Lupita, who's going to talk in a few minutes here, she can hear, but she's deaf. How does that work? Well, it's actually a person that's in this category of deaf functions better with the visual language because they cannot understand everything clear enough through their ears. And they've chosen to go with deaf culture and deaf language. So that's a deaf person. Okay? It's kind of a weird definition. All right. The next thing is a hearing person. Okay, a hearing person is a person that does not understand deaf language or culture. By the way, deaf people are very biased against us as hearing people. They don't like us. We're weird. You think they're weird, they think you're weird. We're even, okay? But they really are biased against us. They think, oh, it's hearing. They really do. You tell a joke, oh, it's a hearing joke. They look at us as a weird group of people because we do this and then we laugh. What was funny about that? Now, they do all the visual stuff and then they laugh. And we think, well, that's kind of weird. And they think it's weird that we just stand still and laugh. Okay, so I mean, they look at us differently. We are an unusual group of people, but hearing people, to deaf people, hearing people are those that do not understand. They look at us, can I say this? They look at us as handicapped. We can't communicate. Okay, just the way we look at them. Okay, the next thing is hard of hearing. Hard of hearing people are people that do not fit in the deaf world and they do not fit in the hearing world. A deaf person looks at a hard of hearing person as a person in between that does not fit anywhere. And there are people like that. Old age deafness, they're hard of hearing. A person that grows up and they can hear well, but they never learn sign language well, and they're kind of in between. They don't hear well enough to really fit in your category of hearing people. And they don't do signs well enough to fit in deaf people. They're in between. Okay? These are some interesting definitions. They're important for us for our discussion today. And finally, an interpreter. What is an interpreter? An interpreter is somebody that does their job, shows up, and then leaves. In the world of deafness, they have to have interpreters. When they go to the doctor, they have to have an interpreter. When they go to the lawyer, they have to have an interpreter. When they go to school, they have to have an interpreter. But by far and large, their interpreters come, they interpret, and they leave. That's not somebody they have a relationship with. That's an important point because deaf people relate relationally. More so than we as hearing people. You can pick your friends out of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Deaf people can pick their friends out of deaf people and hearing people that know sign language. There are a few others. But by far and large, those become their friends. So these are some definitions that are helpful to you. Okay, now let's take our first pamphlet here today, and we're going to talk about this. Are there any questions on anything we've talked about so far? Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So I went up there and I was yelling, but then I thought, they can't be here because they're trespassing. So, I think one of them, they woke up, and the police came, and it was just really hard to communicate with them. They can't be here, they can't stay. Right. Yeah, we'll touch on some of these things, but yes, you can touch deaf people. You can to wake them up. You probably kick their foot or something like that. Yeah, and that's not offensive. We touch deaf people on the shoulders, but if you are without an interpreter, and you're trying to communicate something important, you're going to have an interpreter. Police have to call an interpreter, and somebody has to pay for that interpreter. Interpreters get good money. There are people that work as a profession of interpreting. And we'll actually give you some communication tips here. I've got to actually plan some of that, so we'll get into that. When we get to that part, remind me if I don't answer all the questions at that time, all right? Good. All right, great question. All right, anything else real quick before we move on? Okay, so we're in this 12 reasons why you should be concerned about deaf people, about lost deaf people. This was written by Andrew Foster, who is was a deaf man. He's passed away now. He was a missionary in Africa. He's a man from America. God touched his heart. He went to Gallaudet University, which is a premier university. He ended up getting a doctorate degree eventually. And he said several interesting biblical things about reaching deaf people. And so we're going to highlight now, through the course of this time we have together today, we're going to highlight just certain things. If you follow the highlights, you'll do well on the test. Okay? I'm going to try to highlight everything we're talking about on the test. The reason we're giving tests on those things is because I think they're important. So that's what we're going to put on the test, all right? So if you look in the middle here, yours is not in yellow, but right in the middle section of this pamphlet, why should you be concerned? First thing is that God himself is concerned about deaf people. And we find that in Leviticus 19:14, it says, "Thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind." When it talks about cursing the deaf there, the scripture is very interesting. It says that we should not mock. When it says curse, it's talking about mocking them. They make funny sounds. We make funny sounds. Not good. That is actually very anti-scriptural. And here's the verse for it. Do not curse the deaf. Do not cause the deaf to have to do something that they cannot do. Scripture's clear about that. By the way, as fathers, we're not to provoke our children to wrath. That's the same thing. Don't expect anything a child cannot do. You will actually cause them to become wrathful. With the deaf, we're not to curse them or put them down in any way. That is from Scripture. By the way, we curse the deaf today when we ignore them as far as sharing the gospel with them. He mentioned the thing that's missing is the gospel. That's true. Okay? And so God is concerned about deaf people. The second thing there, because all mankind, like all mankind, deaf are lost and apart from Jesus Christ. We were in a church one time, and a person came up to me afterwards, and they said, "Don't you think that God understands?" Because they're deaf. They can't hear the gospel. Don't you think God understands and will let them into heaven? The person in the Baptist church asked me this. Give me a reason why that won't work. You're in college, you know the verses. Yes, sir. Pardon me? Haven't accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, for the wages of sin is death. Period. Romans chapter 1. Read it sometimes. Romans chapter 1 tells you that every person, no matter what tribe they are from, if they have not heard the gospel, they have not received Jesus Christ, they are damned to hell. That includes the deaf. Okay? Wow. Okay? Next thing. The deaf must be saved only through Jesus Christ. Kind of a follow-up on the next thing, on that previous thing. Next, God is not willing that any should perish. That includes deaf people. Okay? The next thing. Jesus' earthly ministry embraced the deaf. In fact, it was said of him that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. Another verse you may want to write down at that point is Mark chapter 7, verse 32 and following, where it talks about they brought to Jesus a deaf man. And Jesus went away from the multitude. He had multitudes of people he talked to. He went away from that multitude to talk to one deaf man. Sometimes in our efforts to try to reach as many people as we can with the gospel, we ignore the one. Jesus didn't ignore the one. Everyone is important. Everyone is important. Whether they're deaf or whether they're not like you in some other way. Okay. Next at the top of the page there, because deaf are cut off from normal communication. We're going to see this more and more today. But deaf people cannot communicate with whomever they want to. Most deaf people cannot sit down and read their Bible and understand it. Most tracts that you'll give to a deaf person cannot easily be understood. So we have to find a different way. We have to communicate with them visually with sign language. There are some tracts that are visual, but most are just words, words, words. And some of those words are not put together in a way that's logical for deaf people to understand. Okay, so they're cut off from communication. Next thing is deaf as creatures too are included in Jesus' command, go into all the world and preach the gospel to almost every creature. I did it again. To every creature. Okay. Is it almost every or is it every? It's every, of course. Okay. Then the next one here, God plainly expects some deaf people to be in the great harvest in heaven. And there's some verses along there. God expects deaf people to be in heaven. That's why we should reach them. And then every Christian should show gratitude for his physical and spiritual senses. When you show respect and help a deaf person be saved, you are thanking God for your ability to hear, is what he was saying as a deaf man. And then next thing here, aiding the needy deaf people is consistent with Christian love. We say we love people. Giving of ourselves to learn a language or to reach them in their culture is consistent with our Christian message, with salvation. Last thing is this: sharing the gospel with needy deaf people is a source of God's rich blessings. My pastor says it like this. He has a very interesting way of bringing things to a very good point. And he said, our church is like milk. And he says, our church without deaf people is pretty good. Milk is pretty good. But deaf people are like chocolate. And when you add that chocolate in the milk, it's so much better. And that's what he said. He said, our church with deaf people is much better. In our church, our pastor actually has a deaf man come up. They take the offering at time. And there'll be a deaf man or two here taking the offering. And he'll say, Ray, would you pray please? And John, would you interpret? And so I'll raise my voice and interpret in the church as he prays. And whatever Ray says is what I voice as he's praying. And we have our deaf people involved in church. And it's such a great blessing to our church to have that. It touches people's hearts to see deaf people. We have one deaf man as a missionary with our ministry. He's in our church. He's a member of our church. And from time to time, he'll preach. And our pastors had him preach in church or give a testimony. Or he'll be out traveling and share the things that God's blessed in his travels and people have been saved. He'll say, come on up, Alan, and share with our church what God has been doing. And he'll share of the many people that have been saved. It's a blessing to our church. And so deaf people can be a great blessing to your church. Any questions on that? That's pretty straightforward, but I wanted to share that with you. Myths about deaf culture, or reasons we should, not myths, reasons we should reach deaf people. Written by a deaf man, and scriptural, every one of them. Okay? I want to take a moment, and I'm going to have Lupita come up and share a little bit of her testimony, her story. She's not going to take long, but she's going to share. You can have a hearing man talk about deaf ministry all the time, but until you see a deaf person. How many of you know Lupita? Okay, I figured you did. Okay, how many of you know her story? Not many of you. Okay, I'd like for her to tell us a little bit about. We discussed with her what to share. She's going to share some things, and if you don't know sign language, that's okay. Just watch. No, we'll voice interpret. We'll interpret for her. Okay, so Lupita, would you come up and share as we've talked about? She said, do you want me to sign? Yes, I do. Well, good morning, everyone. Some of you, don't know me, but anyway, let me introduce myself. I'm Lupita. This is my sign name, Lupita, like that. And John asked me to teach. I said, sure, be glad to do that. I wanted to tell a little bit. I'm not going to go long, but very briefly, wanted to share about my experience. So, when I grew up, I had an old church, and I went there for many years. They didn't have a deaf ministry. They didn't have a deaf ministry. I went there. Can you imagine? I went to church, and there was no deaf ministry. So I went with my family. They were strong Christians as well, but I didn't know the Bible. I knew nothing really about the Bible. My old pastor, he would speak, and I would try to understand by reading lips. Yeah, I can hear a little bit. I am deaf. I do classify myself as deaf. So I'd try to read his lips. It's really tough. And I'd say, Mom, how can I understand? I don't have an interpreter. I don't have anybody to help me. Mom said, just be patient. It's all right. Just pray, and we'll pray about that. I said, okay, Mom. She's a strong Christian, so I trusted her to do that. But someone actually got a burden and took a laptop, and as he was speaking, they were typing. And it was in English, and quite honestly, I didn't understand English very well. And so over and over and over again, we did this. And I told my mom, I said, Mom, I need to look for a church with an interpreter. So we began to look and couldn't find anyone. Finally, about a few years ago, someone came to my home. What's that? I'm sorry. Who's that? Oh, Isla and Dawn. Okay. I didn't know their names. Okay. Their sign names, Isla and Dawn. Okay. Came to my home and began to discuss a little bit about, I was talking, my mom's Spanish and they were talking English, and it was like, no. They refused, no. Mom said, no. Finally, everything worked out. But it was the first time I came to here at Pacific Baptist Church, and I began to look, and there was an interpreter. I went, oh, wow, cool, I understand. I can understand the interpreter. It's so clear. I understand the Bible. This is great. And I told her, said, see, I need an interpreter. My mom said, okay, yeah, okay, so now you can go. So, Spanish was tough for me to understand. I knew Spanish. I'd known that all my life, but it was really tough. And so, yes, I grew up in a hearing culture. They didn't know anything about deaf people, and so I just kind of had to get along. But I wanted to get around with deaf people. I needed to be around deaf people and be around an interpreter where it was clear. So I wanted to learn the Word of God. That was the point. And so here it's clear. And so I joined the church, and I've been here for 7 years, and what a blessing it is. I now volunteer, help as in the school, and I want people to understand deaf culture, deafness, and myself as a deaf person. I'm deaf and a successful deaf person. And I volunteer in school and help in different ministries and things like that. It's a great blessing. Joseph Esposito, I think is what she spelled. We have to write back and forth about the school. So it works, though. And help in the college and different things. So what a great blessing. I've been doing that for a while. My brother John said, don't give up. Keep going. So, okay, all right, I'll take it. And so Pastor Joseph said, keep going. So I just keep going on. That's my life. That's what I do. Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting, huh? And you may have a question for her. How many of you knew all of that about her? How many of you knew any of that about her? A few. Okay. She grew up, as many deaf people do, in a church with their family. If their family is Christians, they take their deaf child to church, and the deaf child just stands there and sits there. What do you do? What do you do? And if you can type English, but as she said, her language was not English. It wasn't Spanish. I mean, it could be typed in Spanish. But her language, her written language, it's hard to get everything because English is different, or Spanish is different than sign language. Her family speaks Spanish, and so she was kind of stuck. And did you see the joy on her face when she talked about an interpreter? It's like, wow, I can understand. Would you go to church if you couldn't understand? Tough question, huh? I'm supposed to say yes. And so she kept going to church. Alan Snare, a missionary with our ministry, did the same thing. His parents took him to church over and over and over again. He did not understand. He knew nothing about the gospel until he was 20 years of age. And that's when he got saved. Okay, wow. Okay, any questions about that culture like we just shared it? Anything, questions maybe for Lupita? Okay. All right, let's dive into our books then. All right. First thing, understanding ASL culture. You're right here. It's D12. I put the number up on the thing there so you can see each one in case you get confused at all about which book we're in. Let's talk about deaf people as a culture. Is deaf culture real? It sure is. We're on the first page. What is deaf culture? Sometimes you begin, if you're in a foreign culture, you get scared. How many of you have ever been to a foreign country? Okay? Or actually here in the Long Beach area, you can go across town and be in a different culture, can't you? How many of you know Korean culture? Okay, have you ever gone to Korean town, Korean area, and it's like everything is different, and do you know that you know the rules or not know the rules? Is it awkward? Do you get scared sometimes? When you don't know that person, you think, okay, I remember seeing something about that kind of a person, and they did a crime, and I'm wondering if they're going to do a crime on me. You know, you have those questions, don't you? Even if you walk down the street out here, you have those questions, right? Okay, because we fear the unknown. If we know people, if we can communicate with them, then we tend to not think of them as an enemy. But if we don't know them, we don't trust them. Trust is a big issue. So fear of the unknown is a very big, real thing. If you look in the second paragraph, there's this statement here talking about different cultures, and there are in our world we have cultures, we have subcultures, we have subcultures. It seems like a key to that and understanding that is this bottom thing you see here highlighted, and that is the gospel can unite all cultures, and your church is a great example of that. Okay, great diversity of backgrounds here in this church. Is that true? How are you not united? By the gospel. When I get off a plane in Peru, I'm united with those Christians by the gospel. When I go to Ukraine, I'm united with those people by the gospel, even though I don't speak their sign language. And yet we have a bond because of Christianity. Deaf culture is real. And deaf people tend to learn we're down kind of 3/4 of the way through the second paragraph here on page 1. Deaf people tend to learn behaviors and values from their deaf friends. Let's talk about that just for a moment. Most deaf people cannot talk to their parents. Let that sink in. Where are they going to learn what's right and wrong? From their friends. From their friends. I'm talking about the unsaved deaf world. And even saved deaf people, if they don't have a church to go to, if they're not involved in church, they're going to learn what's right and wrong from their friends. How good is friends' advice these days? Some of y'all work on the bus ministry, you know, it's not a good idea. And so deaf people face this. Most hearing parents of deaf children do not know sign language. Most. How would you like to grow up in a home where you could not communicate with your parents? Tough. That's the world we live in. We're talking about culture of deaf people. This is one thing that unites them worldwide because it's true worldwide. Most parents do not learn sign language, no matter where they are. Culture, on the bottom of the page here, that last paragraph, culture has been defined as a system of learned patterns of, and these 4 things we're going to talk about that define a culture: behavior, values, belief, and worldview. So let's talk about these things. Turn the page, and we're on behavior. Behavior is what is done, what is proper to do. What do you do? What type of things are acceptable? In the Southern culture, I learned deaf ministry learned hearing ministry in South Carolina. I was interning in a pastor's church there, and the pastor said, "Now, if they offer us tea, we stay. We're supposed to get on the porch, sit for an hour, and talk with them." That's the way we had to do ministry there. And if they offer us tea, you've got to take it, and you've got to finish it all before you leave. But you don't finish it quite all. You leave a little bit. And he told me all these, like, really? And that's the way you minister down there. Down here, they don't offer you tea. They'll offer you something to leave maybe, but I don't know. It's just different way of looking at things. And you can go quickly with people because people are in a hurry in the city like this. That was in another area. Values. What is valuable? What is good or best? What do people think is the right thing, or what is the best way to do things? Every culture has right and wrongs. Okay, for example, is it okay to pick your nose in public? No. Now, I'm not saying it's okay in deaf culture. I'm just saying in our culture it's not acceptable to do that. But there are things that you do in some cultures that's like, okay, fine. In a farmer's culture, they have a certain way of blowing their nose when they're out in the field and they don't have anything to wipe on. Okay? Some of you are from a farming culture. You know what it is. If you don't know, ask later. I'm not going to show you now. Okay? But these are acceptable ways of doing things because you got to take care of things. Beliefs is another area. What do people believe? What do they say is true in life? Truth helps people live in a world. And even an atheist believes in some sort of truth. Okay? If they say, "I don't believe there's anything absolutely true," then just ask them about that statement they just made. Is that really true or not? Because they contradicted themselves. And then worldview. What is real? For example, today we expect things to happen. We expect there to be Wi-Fi everywhere we go. No, not really? Not in the dorm? No, there's not Wi-Fi everywhere you go? Okay. But you expect there to be electricity. It was in the Philippines, and they didn't expect electricity. When preaching along and the lights went out at night, like, okay, just get flashlights, they're okay, and keep preaching, because you have to flashlights with the deaf. With the hearing, you have to have an audio system. With the deaf, you have to have flashlights and light, and that's what was real to them. That's what's expected. You're going to carry a flashlight. In fact, it's so true that I carry a flashlight with me everywhere I go. Okay, I'm weird. All right. No, you don't have to do that if you work in deaf ministry. It's just me. Okay, so these are the things. Okay, now here are some ways that deaf and hearing people are different. And we're going to get specifically into deaf. We're on the top of page 3. Deaf and hearing people differ in these ways. Now we're going to throw out some generalities here. But deaf people as a culture group in your church, you're going to need to know this. If you're going to work with deaf people at all, you got to know this, because if you want to grow a deaf group, you have to function within their norm, within their way of doing things, all right? Or at least understand their way. Individualism versus being a group. We as hearing people do things individually. We say, show up at this place on time. We say, are you going to the particular outing, okay? And you can decide on your own. Deaf people don't do it that way. We go out and visit, we say, would you come to church? And a person will say yes or no. With a deaf person, they're going to ask all their friends first. I'm going to go to church. You want to go to church? You're not going to go to church? I'm not going to go to church. That's exactly the way they do it. They will ask you, how many deaf people do you have in your church? And if you said 1, they go, oh, no, I'm not going. If you said 20, they go, oh, really? Cool. I'll show up. They want to meet all the other people. They do things as a group. They always do things as a group. We were in Arizona, the church we were in just last weekend, and we were in a deaf church in Phoenix, Arizona. It was an Easter Sunday morning, and the pastor said, now, I was getting ready to preach. I was on the front row, ready to preach. You know, Easter Sunday morning, Resurrection Sunday, I'm going to preach. This is going to be great. And the deaf pastor said, okay, we're going to take Jon and Diane Barr out to eat after church. Where would you like to go? And for 10 minutes, they discussed it. In church, on Sunday morning. They function as a group. They wanted to decide together. Now, they're going to each pay for themselves, but they wanted to decide this thing is together. And then the pastor said, okay, we decided this particular restaurant. Now, there are 2 restaurants, one over here and one over there. Let's decide which one we want to go to. And then they talked for 5 more minutes and finally came up to the decision, we're going to go to this one over here. But their reasoning will blow a hearing person away. What they said was, we're going to choose this restaurant because it is close to the house of one of our elderly members, so that when we finish the meal, she won't have very far to drive. Because if we go here, it's farther for her to drive. They functioned as a group, honoring the group, honoring a certain person in the ministry. Where we don't do that as hearing people, do we? Show up, be there. You know, be there, be square, or whatever they used to say. You know, so they function as a group always. Second thing is segmented versus relationships. We as hearing people have our life in the dorm. We have our life at church. We have our life on the bus route. We have our life, our family life, your family back home. And then you have your personal way you do things and things that are happening to you. And usually when you go to church and somebody says, how are you? You don't say, my little toe hurts. You just say, I'm fine, right? You lie. Okay. I mean, you just I'm fine. You know, you could be, you know, oh, I'm fine. Thank you. You know, because you don't want to go into all the detail, and it's just, but deaf people do right the opposite. If you say, how are you to a deaf person, they're going to go back to last Sunday and they're going to tell you how their week went. That's the way they do it. And Isla's over there laughing because it's so true. And Lupita's saying, yep. Because that's the way they do. They tell you everything. In fact, I was over at a deaf lady's house, and you know, nothing is sacred, it seems like. I was over this older deaf lady's house. I was a young man at the time, and she was much older. And she said, yeah, I had surgery. I had surgery on my hip. And then before I knew it, she went, let me show you. And she was, it's like, no, I don't want to see your hip. And she was just showing me. And they tell you everything. They have private surgeries, and they want to tell you about it. It's like, no, I don't. You know, we're hearing people just say, we have ways of covering that. You know, it was outpatient surgery, nothing big. We don't tell what it was. They're going to tell you. It's crazy. One deaf guy, he said, yeah, I had open heart surgery. And he just went like that, and he just showed me all the stitches all the way down. Oh, cool. And everything is together to them. They don't segment their life. They put it all together. That's important, because when we get together in a deaf ministry, one of the first things we do is say, how are you? How are you? And we talk for 15 or 20 minutes. And when everybody knows how everybody is, then we start our church. It's weird. But it's the way we do ministry with the deaf. If we just come in and all just start, it's kind of awkward for them, because they go like, what's going on? And they know it's hearing people kind of railroad things through. but that's the way we look at things as hearing people. They are relationship oriented. And then the third thing here, achievement versus awarded. You gain value because of what you do as a hearing person. You gain value because of who you are as a deaf person. As a deaf person, if you are a child that is hearing, that has deaf parents, you are a special person. You have a special place in the world. If you had a deaf brother or sister, you're a special person. If you didn't have anybody deaf in your family, why did you learn sign language? And you tell your story like I told my story. I have to tell that whole story every time I meet somebody. It's kind of weird. And they go, oh, okay, wow, okay, he's cool. And I'm okay now. Once they know my story. They are that way. And so they award value to you based on who you are. And then universal versus particular. We as hearing people say, the test is going to be on Friday, come prepared. A deaf person shows up and he says, yeah, but last night my friends came over and it was like, can I wait and take it tomorrow? And the teacher's expected to say yes. Or they expect the teacher to say yes. Because they say, well, it's a particular circumstance. Something special happened. Okay, let's give you a pass. They expect that. Now that can be a problem because they think that about the gospel too. You need to be saved now. Well, but I got this thing I got to work out first. Hearing people do that too, but deaf people do it overwhelmingly. So these are some major areas how deaf and hearing people are different. I'll cover one more thing and we'll take a break. Sound good? Okay. 2 views of deafness. That's on the next page. 2 views of deafness. And this is kind of huge. I have a lot of words up here, but we're talking about these 2 paragraphs. First of all, you can look at deaf people like a doctor looks at deaf people. That's what this is, clinical or pathological view. It's a doctor's view of deafness. And a doctor says, oh, your ears are broke, we can fix that. They're broken, we can fix that. Hearing people tend to look at deaf people as they're broken. Deaf people don't like that. Hearing people think deaf people talk about their deafness. They don't. Hearing people meet deaf people and say, oh, what percent of deaf are you? That's a very offensive question. How did you lose your hearing? That's an offensive question. Can I be straightforward? That's like asking, how did I become white? Okay, I was born that way. You just don't ask that question. How did you get black hair? Or how did you get gray hair now? Okay, I understand that. Okay? But you don't ask a person about certain things, and that's one of those things. You don't ask them how they became deaf. They don't look at themselves as broken. But most hearing people do. Most in the medical field, and most hearing people in general, think that deafness is broken. They say, oh, you're deaf. Did you hear about the cochlear implant? And they go, I know. Okay, they've all heard of all that stuff. And we're looking at them as broken. They're saying, yeah, you think I'm broken. Okay, I got it. And we offend them when we do that. So be careful along that line. The other one is a cultural or sociological view, and that is they're a group of people, a culture group of people. They are worthwhile. They're a valuable group of people. They are in themselves whole. A deaf person does not look at themselves as needy, or they need an interpreter sometimes. But they don't look at themselves. They're a person. Lupita said, look, I'm successful. I'm teaching, I'm helping, I'm volunteering, I'm doing these things, I'm learning the Bible, I'm doing good. Okay? You look at, oh, poor lady. She doesn't say poor lady. She says, look, I'm here. Yesterday, a deaf lady came to me, and she said, it was here in this church actually, last night when we were talking, deaf lady said, the hearing churches want me to go, hearing church, go. Like, but look at me, I'm deaf. I can't. She looked at herself as a person that needs a church that meets her needs. And that's a very real view among deaf people. Okay, so any questions on any of that? That's some heavy stuff actually right there. But if we're going to minister to deaf people, this is the place to start. And we'll get a little lighter as we go along here. Okay? All right. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir. The Christian church has, not Baptist, but the Christian church has produced a Bible. They believe in baptismal regeneration. They've got a Bible in sign language. They're the only group that does. It does not follow received text. It's not designed that way. There are things missing out of it, and there are misinterpretations. It is a different language version entirely, so we're not going from written language to written language, which you can compare real easily. We're going from written language to an interpreted view of that. So the answer, as far as many in our circles are concerned, is no. They have a good attempt at it. It's the only thing they have. And they can't take it to church with them. But they do have it on their phone. I mean, you can get it on your phone. That's the way it's delivered, is visually. There's no written version for the deaf because it didn't work. It's not their language. Yes? Yes, it's not a written language. Yeah. It's just recent years that people have realized it is a foreign language. And nobody in our circles is trying to do that. What we are doing with signthebible.com is we're teaching the Bible verse by verse. That's the best we can, and we take it and expand it. Like sometimes it'll take one verse and we'll talk 30 minutes about one verse. The language is primitive? It is, well, it's a very well-developed language, but it is, as far as we as hearing people, we're visitors in that world. Yeah. Okay. Good thoughts. Any other question or comment on this part of it? Okay. How long do we normally take as a break? 10 minutes. See you in 10 minutes.